Dopaminergic dysfunction in schizophrenia is increasingly seen as more pronounced in the nigrostriatal pathway, particularly within the dorsal striatum. Now, the dorsal striatum is divided into the motor striatum and the associative striatum. We'll see that the associative striatum acts as an integrative hub, connecting to the limbic and the motor regions. The dorsal striatum, along with the ventral striatum, is the major input structure of the basal ganglia motor loop, and thus has classically been regarded as an important brain structure for controlling movement. Therefore, if we think about the striatum, we have the motor striatum, the associative striatum, and the limbic striatum, which is the ventral striatum. The dorsal striatum is divided into the dorsolateral striatum and the dorsomedial striatum, both of which have different functions. The dorsomedial striatum mediates associations between actions and outcomes. Think of it as action-outcome learning. This is the goal-directed part. On the other hand, the dorsolateral striatum mediates the associations between stimuli and responses. Think of it as the stimulus-response learning. This is linked to the expression of habitual behavior. This recognition of the role of the dorsolateral striatum in schizophrenia takes us beyond the mesolimbic pathway and positive symptoms alone. Now let's look at the striatal dynamics and the dopamine receptor function. This is where there is this extra nuance. The action of dopamine in the striatum hinges on two key receptors, D1 receptor and D2 receptor. D1 receptors are low affinity receptors, and they require significant levels of extracellular dopamine to be activated. Thus, they are activated through phasic or burst dopamine firing, driving excitatory signals. So the D1 receptor complex is considered as the excitatory part. In contrast, D2 receptors are more sensitive and thus considered as the high affinity dopamine receptors, and they work to inhibit excitatory response, and thus they can be considered as the inhibitory dopaminergic receptor. The affinity of the D2 receptors to dopamine is 100 times greater than that of D1 receptors. Now, normal homeostatic functioning requires an optimal balance between the D1 excitatory parts and the D2 inhibitory parts. Striatal disruption of the D1-D2 balance plays an important part in the pathophysiology of schizophrenia, as it influences how the brain processes reality. The D1-D2 imbalance isn't just specific to schizophrenia. It also plays an important part in the pathophysiology of OCD and tardive dyskinesia. This D1-D2 imbalance is also relevant to antipsychotic treatment. A recent study by Yun et al. Showed that antipsychotic drug efficacy correlates with the modulation of D1 rather than D2 receptor expressing striatal projection neurons. This study suggested that optimal therapy for psychosis specifically normalizes D1 striatal projection neuron dynamics under hyperdopaminergic conditions and minimally perturbs D1 and D2 striatal projection neuron activity under normal conditions. Now let's look at the role of the associative striatum. The associative striatum bridges communication between the cortex, the limbic regions, and the motor systems. Thus, it acts as integrative hub. The associative region predominantly includes the dorsal precommissural parts of both the caudate nucleus and the putamen. Thus, when the dorsal striatum is affected, it includes both the motor part and the associative striatum. Therefore, dopamine dysregulation here has widespread implications affecting not just emotional regulation, but also motor function and cognitive processes. This highlights that schizophrenia is a broader construct.